6:42, good morning. This is Breakfast with Stephen and Anne.
Right, we have a news review now. A look through the front pages.
The Sun says, got him, reporting on the jail fugitive, nabbed riding a bike by a canal, it says.
The Mirror reports on over 1,300 dead in the Morocco earthquake.
It's risen to more than 2,000 now.
Yeah.
It's a problem with using figures on that. This is devastating. And Daily Star Sunday has the hottest day of the year, saying we're not done yet.
Ooh, yes, lovely. Our news reviewers this morning, writer and commentator Candice Holdsworth and editor of Spite, Tom Slater, and a very good morning to you.
Morning.
Right, I've got...
Here we are.
Going to
We're
first?
starting with Candice, looking at... You see, this, we haven't touched on it in the programme yet, but there's now these accusations of spies, Chinese spies, in the House of Commons, and the Sunday Times looking at this.
Yes, so this is front page of the Sunday Times, and the story's kind of been carrying over the weekend. So a parliamentary researcher has basically been accused of being an agent for China. Apparently, he's a young man in his 20s. He lived in China, and they suspect, I don't know if this has actually been definitively established, that he may have been recruited as a sleeper agent, and he's sort of attached himself to various MPs. What's interesting about this, though, is that this isn't the first time. So, I mean, earlier this year, there was someone called Christine Lee, who I must say has denied these allegations, but she was named by the security services as a possible foreign agent, and she donated, I think, about £500,000 to Barry Gardner.
Yes,
There's also the LinkedIn spy who was targeting people on LinkedIn. And so what they're saying now, what's going on, is there's sort of like quite an aggressive targeting of Westminster, particularly as I think a lot of politicians are taking a more adversarial stance to China. So it may be that they're trying to gain influence in that way. This is at least what the story focuses on anyway.
What is interesting with this is these arrests have been made, but they were made back in March and we're only just finding out about them, which is interesting, actually, in and of itself.
It is, and it's one of those things where it's so difficult to kind of form a view on these things because the details are relatively scant and there's a lot of kind of at least speculation in the press because we're not privy to all those details. And also, I think when you're dealing with a nation like China, not like a nation like Russia as well, because if you've got relatively wealthy, prominent people, in the case of Christine Lee or whatever, they're often quite entangled in the states over there anyway. So what's the difference between someone who just, that's the price of doing business, to someone who's actually some sort of genuine operative? All this stuff is very, very murky, as serious as it is.
Because that's how business is done there, right? I mean, it's very much entangled with the Chinese state. You know, it's not like here. It is very different. It's a very different setup.
Well, look, we need to see what comes from this, but the investigations and things must be well underway 6 months on. It's 6 months since we were arrested. So there you go.
OK, meanwhile, shall we look at the Sunday Telegraph, Tom? And I hadn't even read this. This sounds horrendous. A net zero gas grid shutdown could cost each of us £2,500.
Yes, this is...
How does that work?
So essentially, all of the existing kind of pipelines for the gas grid and so on, it's something which is... You can't just leave it there as part of this sort of transition because the pipes decay, it can undermine roads and so on. So they need to be gotten rid of. There's talk of potentially replacing this network with something that can carry hydrogen, even though there's still question as to whether hydrogen can be a perfect kind of replacement in terms of what we need. And it's just being brought to prominence because of the fact that the mounting cost of net zero is beginning to look eye-watering. So in this case, according to the Sunday Telegraph reporting on this particular official report, £2,300 per household in order to replace. Obviously, if you think about piled on top of that, the general kind of costs of decarbonisation and it's something which has never really been spelled out about net zero. It was always, I think people naturally assumed, oh, this is something that's about technology, we're going to invest in some infrastructure and everything's going to be fine. We're talking about huge costs on individual taxpayers in order to make this transition possible. And in the end, to get towards forms of energy which, frankly, just aren't tried and tested, which aren't cost-effective in the same way. And headlines like this are only going to affirm in many people's minds that this green transition, such as it is on the backs of ordinary people rather than any kind of whiz-bang technology yet to be invented.
My first question on this would be, and it plays both sides a little bit, wouldn't the grid, the actual physical network, have to be replaced at some point anyway? None of it lasts forever.
Well, precisely. I think that's one thing where if it seems like, at least according to the reporting, that this is going to be some sort of additional cost. I don't know if it was the case that if we maintained as part of a gas grid, it would be somehow cheaper. But I suppose that it's one of those things where piled on top of everything else, it again creates that kind of sense of we're trying to rewire the way that our country does, you know, energy and so on. But is it necessarily going to work?
Can you imagine the digging up of roads throughout the country?
It's
Well,
so
that's true.
expensive, you know.
Well, it never ends. Well, that never ends.
No, I know, but it's going
never
to be
ends.
escalated. wouldn't
One
it?
thing you know,
Escalated.
where I live, the council has spent a lot of money at the relaying, like all the roads at the moment. It's a massive project. And you guarantee we've got these lovely new tarmac everywhere now, and you can guarantee that means they're going to dig it up in about a fortnight, and there'll then be marks and lines all the way down it, because it's always the way, isn't it?
Always, always. And they say as well, electric vehicles, for instance, I mean, they put more stress on the road. They do, that's just a fact. That's something that they've discovered.
They are heavy.
Yes, very much so. So that is something to consider as well, just the pressure on the infrastructure and what that will mean.
I just can't imagine a nation having all its roads dug up.
Yeah, well, not at once.
Well, hopefully not.
Not at once. Unless we all get 6 weeks off. Yeah. 6 weeks, be fine.
Oh, crumbs.
Candice, let's have a look at the Observer this morning. And, I mean, NatWest in so much hot water.
Yes.
You've got a new boss now, the NatWest Group, but there's a potential scandal there.
Yeah, so the Observer is talking about Rick Haythornthwaite. So apparently he used to work for Petro-Saudi, which is a big oil group. It's actually got a British arm. It's like Petro-Saudi International. But it was embroiled in a financial scandal where apparently funds from the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund were diverted. And they're asking, you know, how much was he involved in this? You know, what did he do at the time? They're sort of saying that, I don't know if I totally agree with the piece, because it's kind of implicating him without making any direct sort of accusations or saying that he was involved in any way. It's sort of just like by association, which I don't think is totally fair. You know, NatWest is obviously going to be very... they don't want any more scandal. I mean, after what's happened, they've appointed this new guy. He's an absolute financial veteran. They think he'll be good. And then this could complicate things any further. But personally, having read the piece, perhaps, you know, he has loose links, but I can't see him having any direct involvement in this financial scandal. Yeah. I think it's a little weak. I think the link is tenuous.
But the problem is that reputationally, they're in such a high wire at the moment.
Really are.
It is really difficult, but of course this is a mess entirely of their own making in terms of this debanking scandal. And also, I think, although this does remind me in one sense, as Candice says, it's very difficult to establish any kind of firm wrongdoing here at this point. But it is interesting that all these banks have been posturing as very kind of moral and so on. We'll often do business with dodgy people, you know, foreign sheikhs and oligarchs and so on. They'll happily bank with them. They'll happily,
Well,
you know,
don't you think
have
the
an
whole
account with them,
business
but
of
not Nigel
money and
Farage.
banking is probably a little bit dirty in
I think a lot of people were quite surprised through that whole Coots NatWest saga that banks thought of themselves as really progressive and moral. There's not two things you tend to associate with them, so it's
really
there's a bit of
But I'll tell you what, it's
woke-washing going on
worrying.
here.
We've been setting up a new bank account lately, and I know other people who've been doing it even before this latest scandal, about sort of a year, 18 months ago. It is a nightmare to try and set up a bank account.
Yes.
It absolutely takes months.
It's the compliance burden now. I mean,
didn't used to.
No, it didn't used to at all.
Well, there was... I don't know if you saw the piece by Rory Sutherland in The Spectator talking about, basically, I mean, the compliance departments are running the banks now. I mean, there's so much burdensome regulation. I mean, and it's just becoming way too risk-averse. And for ordinary people, it's impacting them. I mean, it's impacting them in terms of opening a bank account, and they'll close them for the most minor things.
Well,
you obviously
without
don't have a
telling you
bank
sometimes.
manager anymore, you know, someone who knows you, they know who you are. You'll just get a letter saying computer says no.
Yeah.
And that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
And it's such a problem.
It's something needs to change, but how you change a system like that, I don't know.
Maybe we're going to feel more and more like this as the years go on, because it won't be computer saying no, it's AI says no. And you won't be able to even argue with it.
I know.
Well, it's a bit like that now, actually.
I've had one or two things published in terms of poetry, though.
Oh, you've been holding out on us.
Yeah.
no, he's
Literary
a poet.
talents out
He's a
there.
poet, if you
Would you
don't know
believe
it.
it? Would you believe it? However, I couldn't write anything about you, Tom, apparently, because according to the Sunday Telegraph, because you're white and able-bodied.
Yes. This is a fascinating investigation Sunday Telegraph has done into literary agents who are now kind of openly advertising for the fact that they're not interested in white, able-bodied stories. There was one particular quote which did make me chuckle from Ash Literary, which is an agency looking for stories for children, essentially, and says, "We are not interested in stories about white, able-bodied World War II evacuees," which is a bit specific, "but would welcome the story from a disabled LGBTQ+, or BIPOC, which means Black, Indigenous and other people of colour, perspective." Not only is that insanely prescriptive, I think it's also one of those things where, at what point does this just become kind of openly discriminatory? It's quite clearly crossed now, and it's one of those things where surely, does anyone really think the worth of a literary piece is
first
based
of all
on
means
the
they're not interested in a Harry Potter.
Exactly. It makes absolutely no sense.
Are they a specialist agency that only deal with LGBTQ plus disabled stories?
It seems not, and it seems like a lot of these agencies are carrying on as if that is the case, but there's just a general kind of mood in the publishing world, which is that whatever is pale, male and stale is not very interesting. And I just find it such an odd way to look at literature, which should be about taking you out of your own experience, telling a different kind of story. Why do we have to put it in these boxes? There's
a lot of this, though, and it's very difficult because you don't want to come across as in any way prejudiced, and I'm all for everybody being represented.
Yeah.
But we are a predominantly white, able-bodied and straight country. Right? I mean, that's just the way it is. I walk past, there's a very big department store-style company just round the corner. Massive posters. I walked past it the other day. There wasn't a single white person in the posters selling clothes. And you just think, well, I'm all for... Of course we should have black people or Asian people or whatever as models. But why no white people?
I know. It starts becoming very rigid. And the thing is, as well, is, you know, it's not just this. It's not saying that they don't just want people who are able-bodied and of a certain ethnic background. They'll often say things like, you can't talk about anything outside of your own direct experience. And you just think, but that's the beauty of literature. It takes you outside of your experiences. In fact, it's, as some you know, evolutionary biologists have said, it's a powerful tool for empathy. I mean, you think of, like, the Diary of Anne Frank, for instance, you know, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah. I mean, those took people outside of their everyday experiences and allowed them to empathise with people who were very discriminated against.
Well, heck, it doesn't say much for Arthur C. Clarke, does it? You never get another sci-fi book.
No.
Would you, if you have to only write about what you know?
What was that book you were telling me about yesterday, the one that was set in Botswana?
Botswana, the #1 ladies' detective agency.
One of my favourites.
Yes.
Love it.
But written by Alexander McCall Smith, who's from Scotland.
I know. But he went there and he was fascinated.
But talk about taking you out of yourself and giving you another experience through literature.
Yes, and it is. I mean, it can even... We were saying as well, it's so powerful you can empathise with villains. You know, like Richard III. You know, he's doing monstrous things, but you empathise with him because you see everything through his eyes.
Yeah.
I just don't like them setting rules like that.
Yeah.
What they should do is read the book in front of them and see if it's any good.
And I think the biggest problem that the publishing industry has at the moment is that it's so undiverse where things like social class is concerned. I mean, that's one thing where, even in previous eras, you had working-class authors who would kind of managed to get through the cracks, who would manage to kind of make a name for themselves. Publishing is an increasingly upper-middle-class business in terms of what
also, don't you think they're a bit like banks? They've had it their way far too long, publishing houses.
Yeah, but they can do what they like, can't they? It's their, it's their own business.
Completely now, because what a lot of authors are doing are self-publishing and then promoting their books on social media. And a lot of authors are beginning to make their way through the publishing maze.
It's actually an opportunity, right, for people who say, well, I'm not going to be rigid, I'm going to go the other way. And so that could be, they could find a market quite easily.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. But it's. I tell you what, it's not about getting something published that way. It's about getting it promoted.
Well, that's the thing.
Which is the
yes.
But social media can do that if you're wise enough.
Can to an extent. Though I got the royalties through for my book through the other day. 6-month royalties, £17 something or other.
Yay! Ching!
There we go.
They did say when they did it, they said, you won't make any money out of poetry. And that's proved to be true. But there you go.
Nevertheless, it's nice.
Thank you both. We'll catch up with you a little bit later on. Look forward to that. In the meantime, let's see what the weather's going to do for you today with Rachel.